Cultural studies is an interdisciplinary field that examines the political dynamics of contemporary culture, including popular culture and its historical foundations. Cultural studies researchers generally investigate how cultural practices relate to wider systems of power associated with, or operating through, social phenomena. These include ideology, class structures, national formations, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and generation. Employing cultural analysis, cultural studies views cultures not as fixed, bounded, stable, and discrete entities, but rather as constantly interacting and changing sets of practices and processes. The field of cultural studies encompasses a range of theoretical and methodological perspectives and practices. Although distinct from the discipline of cultural anthropology and the interdisciplinary field of ethnic studies, cultural studies draws upon and has contributed to each of these fields. Cultural studies was initially developed by British Marxist academics in the late 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, and has been subsequently taken up and transformed by scholars from many different disciplines around the world. Cultural studies is avowedly and even radically interdisciplinary and can sometimes be seen as anti-disciplinary. A key concern for cultural studies practitioners is the examination of the forces within and through which socially organized people conduct and participate in the construction of their everyday lives. Cultural studies combines a variety of politically engaged critical approaches drawn including semiotics, Marxism, feminist theory, ethnography, post-structuralism, post-colonialism, social theory, political theory, history, philosophy, literary theory, media theory, film video studies, communication studies, political economy, translation studies, museum studies and art history criticism to study cultural phenomena in various societies and historical periods. Cultural studies seeks to understand how meaning is generated, disseminated, contested, bound up with systems of power and control, and produced from the social, political and economic spheres within a particular social formation or conjuncture. The movement has generated important theories of cultural hegemony and agency. Its practitioners attempt to explain and analyze the cultural forces related and processes of globalization. During the rise of neoliberalism in Britain and the US, cultural studies both became a global movement, and attracted the attention of many conservative opponents both within and beyond universities for a variety of reasons. A worldwide movement of students and practitioners with a raft of scholarly associations and programs, annual international conferences and publications carry on work in this field today. Distinct approaches to cultural studies have emerged in different national and regional contexts. Sardar's characteristics. In his 1994 book, Introducing Cultural Studies, Orientalist scholar Ziauddin Sardar lists the following 5 main characteristics of cultural studies. The objective of cultural studies is to understand culture in all its complex forms, and analyzing the social and political context in which culture manifests itself. Cultural study is a site of both study, analysis and political criticism. For example, not only would a cultural studies scholar study an object, but they may also connect this study to a larger political project. Cultural studies attempts to expose and reconcile constructed divisions of knowledge that purport to be grounded in nature. Cultural studies has a commitment to an ethical evaluation of modern society. One aim of cultural studies could be to examine cultural practices and their relation to power, following critical theory. For example, a study of a subculture, such as white working-class youth in London, would consider their social practices against those of the dominant culture, in this example, the middle and upper classes in London who control the political and financial sectors that create policies affecting the well-being of white working-class youth in London. There are numerous published accounts of the history of cultural studies. Dennis Dworkin writes that, a critical moment, in the beginning of cultural studies as a field was when Richard Hoggart used the term in 1964 in founding the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies (CCCS) at the University of Birmingham. The center would become home to the development of the intellectual orientation that has become known internationally as the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, thus becoming the world's first institutional home of cultural studies. Hoggart appointed as his assistant Stuart Hall, who would effectively be directing CCCS by 1968. Hall formally assumed the directorship of CCCS in 1971, when Hoggart left Birmingham to become Assistant Director General of UNESCO. Thereafter, the field of cultural Studies became closely associated with Hall's work. In 1979, Hall left Birmingham to accept a prestigious chair in sociology at the Open University, and Richard Johnson took over the directorship of the center. In the late 1990s, restructuring at the University of Birmingham led to the elimination of CCCS and the creation of a new Department of Cultural Studies and Sociology (CSS) in 1999. Then, in 2002, the university's senior administration abruptly announced the disestablishment of CSS, provoking a substantial international outcry. The immediate reason for disestablishment of the new department was an unexpectedly low result in the UK's research assessment exercise of 2001, though a dean from the university attributed the decision to inexperienced, macho management. The RAE, a holdover initiative of the Margaret Thatcher-led British government of 1986, determines research funding for university programs. To trace the development of British cultural studies, see, for example, the work of Richard Hoggart, E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, Paul Willis, Angela McRobbie, Paul Gilroy, David Morley, Charlotte Brunsdon, Richard Dyer, and others. Stuart Hall's directorship of CCCS at Birmingham. Beginning in 1964, after the initial appearance of the founding works of British cultural studies in the late 1950s, Stuart Hall's pioneering work at CCCS, along with that of his colleagues and postgraduate students, gave shape and substance to the field of cultural studies. This would include such people as Paul Willis, Dick Hebdige, David Morley, Charlotte Brunsdon, John Clark, Richard Dyer, Judith Williamson, Richard Johnson, Ian Chambers, Dorothy Hobson, Chris Whedon, Tony Jefferson, Michael Green, and Angela McRobbie. Many cultural studies scholars employed Marxist methods of analysis, exploring the relationships between cultural forms, i.e., the superstructure, and that of the political economy, i.e., the base. By the 1970s, the work of Louis Althusser radically rethought the Marxist account of base and superstructure in ways that had a significant influence on the Birmingham School. Much of the work done at CCCS studied youth subcultural expressions of antagonism toward respectable, middle-class British culture in the post-World War II period. Also during the 1970s, the politically formidable British working classes were in decline. Britain's manufacturing industries, while continuing to grow in output and value, were decreasing in share of GDP and numbers employed, and union roles were shrinking. Millions of working-class Britons backed the rise of Margaret Thatcher, through the labour losses. For Stuart Hall and his colleagues, this shift in loyalty from the Labour Party to the Conservative Party had to be explained in terms of cultural politics, which they had been tracking even before Thatcher's first victory. Some of this work was presented in the cultural studies classic, Policing the Crisis, and in other later texts such as Hall's The Hard Road to Renewal, Thatcherism and the Crisis of the Left, and New Times, The Changing Face of Politics in the 1990s. Late 1970s and beyond. By the late 1970s, scholars associated with the Birmingham School had firmly placed questions of gender and race on the cultural studies agenda, where they have remained ever since. Also by the late 1970s, cultural studies had begun to attract a great deal of international attention. It spread globally throughout the 1980s and 1990s. As it did so, it both encountered new conditions of knowledge production, and engaged with other major international intellectual currents such as post-structuralism, postmodernism, and postcolonialism. The wide range of cultural studies journals now located throughout the world, as shown below, is one indication of the globalization of the field. Developments outside the UK. In the US, prior to the emergence of British cultural studies, several versions of cultural analysis had emerged largely from pragmatic and liberal pluralist philosophical traditions. However, in the late 1970s and 1980s, when British cultural studies began to spread internationally, and to engage with feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and race, critical cultural studies, i.e., Marxist, feminist, post-structuralist, etc., expanded tremendously in American universities in fields such as communication studies, education, sociology, and literature. Cultural Studies, the flagship journal of the field, has been based in the U.S. since its founding editor, John Fiske, brought it there from Australia in 1987. A thriving cultural studies scene has existed in Australia since the late 1970s, when several key CS practitioners emigrated there from the UK, bringing British cultural studies with them. After Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister of the UK in 1979. A school of cultural studies known as Cultural Policy Studies is one of the distinctive Australian contributions to the field, though it is not the only one. Australia also gave birth to the world's first professional cultural studies association, now known as the Cultural Studies Association of Australasia, in 1990. Cultural studies journals based in Australia include International Journal of Cultural Studies, Continuum, Journal of Media and Cultural Studies, and Cultural Studies Review. In Canada, cultural studies has sometimes focused on issues of technology and society, continuing the emphasis in the work of Marshall McLuhan, Harold Innis, and others. Cultural studies journals based in Canada include Topia, Canadian Journal of Cultural Studies. In African rights and Third World issues are among the central topics treated. There is a thriving cultural and media studies scholarship in Southern Africa, with its locus in South Africa and Zimbabwe. Cultural studies journals based in Africa include the Journal of African Cultural Studies. In Latin America, cultural studies have drawn on thinkers such as José Martí, Ángel Rama, and other Latin American figures, in addition to the Western theoretical sources associated with cultural studies in other parts of the world. Leading Latin American cultural studies scholars include Néstor García Canclini, Jesús Martín Barbero, and Beatriz Sarlo. Among the key issues addressed by Latin American cultural studies scholars are decoloniality, urban cultures, and post-development theory. Latin American cultural studies journals include the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies. Even though cultural studies developed much more rapidly in the UK than in continental Europe, there is significant cultural studies presence in countries such as France, Spain, and Portugal. The field is relatively undeveloped in Germany, probably due to the continued influence of the Frankfurt School, citation needed, which is now often said to be in its third generation, which includes notable figures such as Axel Honneth. Cultural studies journals based in continental Europe include the European Journal of Cultural Studies, the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, French Cultural Studies, and Portuguese Cultural Studies. In Germany, the term cultural studies specifically refers to the field in the Anglosphere. Especially British cultural studies, 33 to differentiate it from the German Kulturwissenschaft, which developed along different lines and is characterized by its distance from political science. However, Kulturwissenschaft and cultural studies are often used interchangeably, particularly by lay people. Throughout Asia, cultural studies have boomed and thrived since at least the beginning of the 1990s. Cultural studies journals based in Asia include Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. In India, the Center for Study of Culture and Society, Bangalore, and the Department of Cultural Studies at the English and Foreign Languages and the University of Hyderabad are two major institutional spaces for cultural studies. Marxism has been an important influence upon cultural studies. Those associated with CCCS initially engaged deeply with the structuralism of Louis Althusser, and later in the 1970s turned decisively toward Antonio Gramsci. Cultural studies has also embraced the examination of race, gender, and other aspects of identity, as is illustrated, for example, by a number of key books published collectively under the name of CCCS in the late 1970s and early 1980s, including Women Take Issue, Aspects of Women's Subordination 1978, and The Empire Strikes Back, Race and Racism in 70s Britain 1982. Gramsci and Hegemony. To understand the changing political circumstances of class, politics, and culture in the United Kingdom, scholars at the Birmingham School turn to the work of Antonio Gramsci, an Italian thinker, writer, and Communist Party leader. Gramsci had been concerned with similar issues. Why would Italian laborers and peasants vote for fascists? What strategic approach is necessary to mobilize popular support in more progressive directions? Gramsci modified classical Marxism, and argued that culture must be understood as a key site of political and social struggle. In his view, capitalists used not only brute force police, prisons, repression, military to maintain control, but also penetrated the everyday culture of working people in a variety of ways in their efforts to win popular consent. It is important to recognize that for Gramsci, historical leadership, or hegemony, involves the formation of alliances between class factions, and struggles within the cultural realm of everyday common sense. Hegemony was always, for Gramsci, an interminable, unstable and contested process. Scott Lash writes. In the work of Hall, Hebdige and Macrobie, popular culture came to the fore. What Gramsci gave to this was the importance of consent in culture. If the fundamental Marxists saw the power in terms of class versus class, then Gramsci gave to us a question of class alliance. The rise of cultural studies itself was based on the decline of the prominence of fundamental class versus class politics. Edgar and Sedgwick write. The theory of hegemony was of central importance to the development of British cultural studies, particularly the Birmingham School. It facilitated the analysis of the ways subordinate groups actively resist and respond to political and economic domination. The subordinate groups needed not to be seen merely as the passive dupes of the dominant class and its ideology.